So a shock absorber is a system that's comprised of a damper and a spring in some cases, or just a damper. And its basic function is to control movement of the wheel versus the chassis. They achieve that by using a tube in which there's oil and sometimes a gas, either air or, in our case, nitrogen. And the gas pressure allows the shocks to return to full extension and allows compressibility. So you have movements inside the shock that's pushing the oil. And basically, all a shock is doing is managing impacts and movement by forcing oil through some kind of a passage. And you control that passage. It's either fixed or adjustable, but by controlling this passage, you control how much force will be dispersed by the shock.
Warning. The 4x4 Canada podcast contains discussion about exploring mountains, camping beside lakes, and enjoying the outdoors. Guests also talk about jumping race trucks side by side, racing 1,000 horsepower rigs across mud pits, and jumping monster trucks over stacks of buses. None of this is for the faint of heart. The 4x4 Canada podcast is not responsible for bringing out your inner adrenaline junkie or making you want to get out there and explore the back roads from coast to coast. The 4x4 Canada podcast is not responsible for broken parts due to jumping your vehicle, hitting mud poles too hard, crossing deep streams, and doing other dumb shit. However, we will take credit for inspiring you to explore mountaintops, spend quality time outdoors with your friends, or meeting new like-minded people, and most importantly of all, following your dreams. Welcome to the 4x4 Canada podcast. I'm your host, Wes, and today we have a really special guest, Patrick from Elka Suspension. As everyone knows, Elka is a leader worldwide in the suspension, and they are actually based in Montreal and really happen to have a Canadian-based shock manufacturer on board today. How you doing today, Pat?
Very good, Wes. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing excellent. I tell you, it's sunny skies. There's not a cloud in the sky out here, so we're doing good. I just want to give a real quick mention to our listeners that we are going to a bi-weekly on the podcast, and it's just timing with my new job. I'm on the road a lot, and I'm not getting home till 6 o'clock at night or later. And I also want to concentrate more on my health and getting out there and getting back into running and all that kind of stuff. And to the YouTube guys that do one YouTube video a week, I have no idea how you do it, because it's a struggle doing one podcast a week. Hats off to you guys doing one YouTube a week. I know we got a lot of our friends and listeners out there doing one YouTube a week, and I have absolutely no idea how you do it. So are you any good at that kind of stuff, Pat? Are you into any of that?
I'm more of a watcher than a doer. If I can get any spare time, I'll use it to ride instead of film.
Yeah, I hear you on that one. It's interesting watching some of these guys on YouTube, how much time it must take to do some of these videos. I know what it is for the spoken word. I can't imagine adding video to it.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of rides with YouTubers, and you're always stopping for the filming, and I see the work they put in. I respect the work they put in, but I would never do it myself.
Yeah, I hear you on that one. Before we get into it, one other quick question for you, Pat. Jeep or Toyota?
Toyota.
Okay, beautiful. Okay, we're going to keep this interview going then. You answered correctly, so.
Not sure if you can see, but my 4Runner is parked right behind me.
Oh, perfect. There we go. See, that's one good thing about Trisha not being here is we can talk Toyotas all day long. So unfortunately, Trisha is not with us today. She had to work, and her schedule's always a little mixed up. I know she wanted to talk to you, but we'll carry on without her. As I mentioned earlier, we are talking with Pat from Elka Suspension, and I've been really looking forward to talking to you. I absolutely love your product. Got a lot of friends running it, and they have all been super happy. Our listeners, will put this in the show notes, but our listeners can reach out at elkasuspension.com and Elka Suspension on all the social media, and that's ELKA. Elka is known as a top-of-the-line shock manufacturer from Quebec. As I mentioned, you guys are selling all around the world. I've seen guys posting in the States and over in Europe with the products, and you guys are not just 4x4. You guys actually, 4x4 world came to you guys a little later in your life with Elka, right? You guys started off as a power sports company first?
Yes, that's correct. We started with the mostly sports and racing ATVs when the company started. We then diversified to include sports utility quads, spiders, more. We did motorcycles for a while. We did mountain bikes for a while. And then we ventured into the side-by-sides, the snowmobiles. So basically every toy that has a motor and it was off-road.
How long's Elka been around?
The company was started in 2000 out of one of the founders' garage, and it quickly grew. So it's going to be our 25th anniversary this year.
Awesome. Imagine you have a good party planned for that one, eh?
I'd love to say yes, but apparently we're too busy to plan one.
Fair enough. Now, as I mentioned, you guys are just outside of Montreal, right?
Yes, on the South Shore in a small town called Boucherville.
Yep.
So we're basically like less than 10 minutes away from Montreal downtown.
And are all your shock absorbers made in Canada, or built in Canada, I should say?
All our shocks are assembled in Canada.
Yep.
They're designed in Canada. Some of the manufacturing of the parts is also made in Canada, but we do have to rely on suppliers across the world for specific parts, mainly because there's very specialized parts that are only available in some portions of the world. Most of the machining is also done overseas for both cost and quality concerns.
Yep. Hopefully, not to get too political, but hopefully with everything happening in the world, it doesn't throw a wrench into it, for lack of better terms. So
the uncertainty is, for a fact, in terms of trade tariffs and stuff, we're not hit right now. We're waiting to get hit as part of the automobile market that's going to be impacted by 25% tariff. But there's still discussions and exceptions that we hope we're going to be part of. But the power sport side of the business right now is not affected.
Good to hear. I know you and I were talking last week off air via email, and there's definitely some concerns, and you're working busy to try and find everything. The goalposts keep on changing every day, right? So it's really hard to make business decisions and such as the goals keep on changing.
Yeah, just the shipping of orders that's been already placed, the customers have concern, and luckily we're one of the few manufacturers that sell direct to consumers, so we have a connection with the consumer, so we can keep them updated on what's happening, but it's a lot of work.
Yeah, no doubt. I don't want to get too much into politics on it, because that could all be a whole hour conversation going there. And just hopefully everything works out good for you guys and the rest of the automotive parts manufacturers in Canada. Hopefully everything starts to settle down a little bit for us. So shocks, that's basically all you guys do is shocks. Yeah. There's companies that do other things. They do shocks and they do other suspension products and stuff like that. But I think you guys have got the right idea where you're going just with shocks. So therefore shocks, like that is all you do is shocks.
Yes, that's our expertise, and focusing on just that product helps us push the extra mile and go into more details about the product and the tuning instead of just focusing on the surface. The other thing is, if you want to do multiple stuff, you're going to have to be dispersed across all these things, whereas our operations are solely focused on shocks and springs, which are related. And that's what we do. We stick to what we know.
I think it's a great idea, to be honest with you. That's a product that you know quite well, and you guys are always developing new technology. And if you end up spreading into other areas of suspension, you're also spreading yourself thinner. You're looking at more engineers on hand and more investment, etc. So I think, like you said, let's stick with what you know and perfect it more and more each time.
Yeah, there's also another advantage of doing that is, we're a very consumer-focused company. And as a consumer ourselves, we know that you could pretend, but we're never going to be as good as the best A-arms manufacturer. Yeah. We're never going to be as good as the geometry specialists. So we'd rather be the best at shocks and work with those specialists when we develop our products to make sure that they're engineered as a complete package, but even if they're not sold as a complete package.
Yep.
So that gives more options to the consumer and more options in terms of price point, adjustment options, but still have the confidence that it's been developed and tuned with the manufacturer of the other components that we're interfacing with.
And one thing I do think is really unique with you guys is that The customer, if they're looking at purchasing instead of your guys' shocks, you've got multiple shocks for each vehicle. And if they're not quite sure what they need, they can get a hold of you and get your input and your feedback on that.
Exactly. That's one of the key aspects of Elka, and one of our founding pillars of our brand is that we have a direct connection to the consumer. We're basically the only manufacturer you can call upon and talk to the actual guys making the shocks, designing and tuning the shocks, and you get that input to help you select the right product for your budget and your type of use.
Yeah, I think that's a unique service you guys offer that pretty much none of the other shock manufacturers really do. So I think that's key for sure. But let's get back to the basics of shock absorbers and let's throw it out there. What are shock absorbers? We see them on the vehicle. I'm very well versed in it. I've spent years in the racing and as well as the aftermarket, but I know a lot of our listeners may be new people to the industry in that. So they just see what they call shock absorbers on a vehicle. But what basically are shock absorbers?
So a shock absorber is a system that's comprised of a damper and a spring in some cases, or just a damper. And its basic function is to control movement of the wheel versus the chassis. They achieve that by using a tube in which there's oil and sometimes a gas, either air or in our case, nitrogen. And the gas pressure allows the shocks to return to full extension and allows compressibility. So you have movements inside the shock that's pushing the oil. And basically, all a shock is doing is managing impacts and movement by forcing oil through some kind of a passage. And you control that passage. It's either fixed or adjustable, but by controlling this passage, you control how much force will be dispersed by the shock.
And that's basically where you're going onto a road that's got washboard, say, for example. That's where the shock is. It's called a shock absorber for a reason. It's absorbing that up and down of movement of the wheels.
Exactly. When you think of a vehicle, there's a mass to the vehicle that's suspended, which is it's above the suspension. And to keep that mass high, you're going to use springs, either leaf springs or coil springs. So springs are only there to keep the vehicle at a certain height. But then when the vehicle is in movement, its center of gravity will move towards the ground, or the wheels will try to go in when you hit an impact. And that kind of movement, if you don't have a shock absorber, is going to be amplified by the spring. So the only job of a shock absorber is to actually stop that movement. So you allow only the amount of travel you need and not much.
Yeah. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you guys have a variety of shocks for each application. And I know you guys have tons for the power sports. But today we're going to mostly talk about your vehicles, your 4x4 vehicles, but for lack of better terms, regular shocks. I know your guys' shocks are not regular. They're not the old RS5000 pogo sticks that we had before, right? But on your regular shocks, you have what you call a 2.0 and the 2.5 IFP. What's the difference between the 2.0 and the 2.5, and what does the IFP mean?
If you take a standard OEM shock on your vehicle, in the tube, you're going to have oil and gas mixed all together, usually. So this is like an entry-level shock that's designed for mild use. As soon as you go off-roading and more aggressive, if you shake that tube, the oil is going to mix with the gas and you're going to lose performance. So our entry-level shock is called an IFP because it has an internal floating piston. So inside of the tube, you have a floating piston that's separating the oil from the gas, which improves the performance and durability and maintains that performance in harder conditions, high-speed movement. And the difference between a 2.0 to a 2.5 is basically just the diameter of the shock body. So by 2.0, we refer to the internal dimensions of the tube. The bigger the tube, the bigger impacts it can withstand and the more oil it can move. So it's better suited to have a bigger shock when you're more aggressive or you have more weight on the vehicle. Our 2.0 is designed for street driving, like a daily driving truck, that you want to do some mild off-roading with it. A 2.0 will be plenty of shock as an upgrade over OEM shocks for most customers. Some customers are going to drive more spirited and they're going to push the machine a little more. then a 2.5 is more adapted. So these two models are what we call a basic shock, which has only a spring preload adjustment that you set before you install. And that's it. There's no other adjustment to mess with, so you just install, forget about them, and ride them.
Yeah.
Another advantage of the high FP is because the gas pressure is inside of the tube, as the shock is compressing, you're going to get more and more resistance as the gas reaches higher pressure, which means it's going to ramp up in terms of damping. So it's going to get a little harder as you go deeper in the stroke, which means for mild off-roading or beginners, it's a very good way of controlling bottom out. You don't want to bottom out too harsh, or you're going to have that kind of a ramp up. As you move on to other models with reservoirs, the only difference to a reservoir model is that instead of having the gas and floating piston inside the tube of the shock, it is attached and external, which means you get a full range of motion from the shock. And it's more linear in terms of feel, so it's more predictable for more aggressive driving. Yep. And you have a bigger oil volume to keep the shocks running at low temperature. The biggest enemy of a shock is temperature, because you're going to degrade your oil. The metal's going to get hot and it's going to get softer, so you're going to lose damping properties. You want to run your shocks as cool as possible, so having an external reservoir will help with cooling. You're going to have more oil volume, and you're going to have a bigger gas chamber, so it feels more linear, more predictable, but it can also withstand bigger hits.
Yep.
And if you go to our high-end model, the 2.5 DC standing for dual compression, then you have adjustable restriction on the oil flow from the main shock to the reservoir. So basically, it can withstand even bigger impacts, and it can be adjusted to suit your driving style.
And one thing you mentioned, that heat is a big concern with shock absorbers, and you end up getting to what we call shock fade when it gets too hot. And our listeners may notice that if they're running, say, washboard for a long period of time, that shock is doing so much work, and you go and you put your hand on the shock and it's warm. And some of your least expensive shocks will be hot to touch. Whereas if you go to a shock with a remote reservoir, it has that extra fluid capacity. So it also allows it to keep cooler because there's more fluid flowing back and forth.
Correct.
Yeah. Shock fade is a big thing, especially when you're running, like I say, that washboard all day. It makes a huge difference. And you notice it when you're driving too. So now, going back to the adjustability of the shock, you have, coming off of that, the bypass is where you have that knob, and there's 3 settings on yours?
There's actually 2 adjusters on ours.
Okay.
And if you compare that to a bypass shock, either an internal bypass or external bypass, depending on the kind of vehicle, a bypass means that for a certain portion of the shock stroke, you can bypass the main piston. So you can get a softer portion. And then when you reach deeper into travel, you're going to stop bypassing, and you're going to have the full resistance of the piston. So we call that technology position sensitive, because it's the damping level or the harshness or the resistance of the shock will vary depending where it's in its travel. Our shocks are speed sensitive. So there's 2 circuits, and the shock will react differently, not based on the position where it's at, but on the speed it wants to compress, which means you have a circuit for low speed compression. This circuit in our shock is controlled by the small red knob, and this will control slow movement of the shock. So body roll, diving when you're braking, squatting when you accelerate, and also when you're driving on uneven terrain, something like a G out or a G off, it's going to control how much chassis movement you have related to the ground. So that's all low speed. So that's one circuit. And the other circuit is the high speed. So it takes a much higher pressure to open that circuit. And in our shock, the second adjuster is more like a bypass valve, so like a poppet valve.
Yep.
If you hit something, there's a certain level of resistance from the low speed bend, but when there's too much pressure building because it's too much for that main circuit, it's going to open a second circuit that's going to pop off momentarily to reduce the pressure, absorb the impact, and then it's going to close again, which means if you use a bypass, it's going to feel like it's very soft on the top, and then when you go deeper, it's going to have proper damping so you don't bottom out. With our shocks, you can adjust them for the same kind of feeling, very soft and more resistance on an impact, or you could do the opposite, which is much better for street driving, very firm and planted, just like a sports car. But if you still hit cracks and bumps, the second circuit's going to blow off and absorb those impacts. So we feel that for most consumers, that kind of technology is more beneficial because you can actually adjust the shocks to react differently depending on the situation and not just on the position, because position could be good if you're driving a trophy truck, but that's not suitable to daily driving.
So somebody, if they got to drive, say, 2 hours to a trailhead, they can have it on that firmer setting. When they're airing down their tires, they just flip the knob to go to the first style like you're talking about.
Exactly. And very often with our shocks, especially on Toyotas that are built like an overland vehicle, we're going to use a lot of low speed. We want that shock to be very firm so it doesn't sway too much on the street. And when we reach the trail, what we're going to do is we're just going to increase the high speed a little bit so we don't bottom out on the impacts. But depending on your driving style, you may want to have that firm platform for trail riding because you're crawling so slow, and you don't want to exaggerate movement of the vehicle because it's loaded, and it's very often the center of gravity is very high. So you don't want to tip over. You want it to be firm and predictable. But if you're driving very flat terrain and you want to bomb and flat out 50, 70, 80 kilometers an hour, you can open up and make it a little more compliant and more comfortable and still have that protection against bottoming out. So Elka, as a shock tuner and manufacturer, we decided that we want to make shocks for 80% of the people that are average off-roaders and daily drivers, and not specifically targeted at racers and trophy truck driving.
To be honest with you, the majority of people with four-wheel drive vehicles, 80% is done on the highway. Going back and forth to work or to the trailhead, etc. It makes a lot more sense going that way. It must be quite interesting when a new vehicle comes to market. Let's pick that 2024 Tacoma, for example. And you've not only got to design the shock itself in regards to the outsides, your mounting points, whether it's a stud in the top or a coilover design or whatever, but you've also got to figure out the valving inside on how, if it's a heavy vehicle, but obviously there's going to be different valving between a 3/4 ton Dodge or a 1-ton Dodge with a diesel in it versus a Toyota or a light Jeep. So it must be really interesting getting to the design before it goes on to production.
The proper word is interesting, but the second word that's come to my mind is sometimes scary, because we don't start from scratch. We take in a vehicle, we're going to measure the geometry, we're going to simulate the geometry in a software. So we know what the motion ratio is. For example, if the shock is moving 1 inch, when the wheel is moving 2 inches, we're going to know that it's a 2-to-1 motion ratio. So by figuring out that kind of information ahead, we can already, based on our experience, be in the ballpark of what kind of valving we need and what kind of force we're dealing with at the wheel. And all we got to do is relate that into the shock by having the proper shim stack. Then it's going to be just a matter of field testing, driving the vehicle. Usually we're going to start with a stock vehicle. We're going to test it, assess what's good, what's not good, what can we improve, what we don't want to lose that's good already. And from there, we're going to do our testing and make small increments towards our goals and what we want to achieve. And then we're validating that with data acquisition and dyno testing. And in the end, there's still a bit of, we call it a black art or some kind of a black magic. You got to have experience on similar vehicles and experience with different kind of shocks so you know when it feels good.
Yeah, I know coming from the racing side, there's lots of times we put in new shocks, coilovers, or bypasses, and you get it all, okay, this is what we figure we're going to need, and you go out and run it. Oh my God, that's not even close to what we want kind of idea. And so you're going through and you're changing spring rates, you're changing coilover springs, or you're changing valving, or more gas, higher pressure in there and stuff like that. So I can only imagine what's coming at from a manufacturer like yourselves. There's got to be, I imagine, probably almost a year before you get a shock out, or a good 8 months before you get a shock out on a new vehicle, right?
It's going to depend on the vehicle. For example, when we started with the development of Jeeps, it was our first off-road vehicle that was big as a truck or big as a Jeep. We were used with UTV, so the additional weight brought different challenges.
Yeah.
We had a pretty good learning curve for about a year of development on the design. Also, just scaling up our shock platform from UTVs to trucks. You got to withstand much more stuff like weather, salt on the streets. There's more elements to figure out. But once you have that dialed in, then applying a recipe to a different vehicle is not very long.
Okay.
We've done some trucks that we fitted here. For example, if we start with an FJ Cruiser and move on to the 4Runner, the fitment, the shock placement, the reservoir installation, everything like that can be done within a week. And then it could be as fast as 2-3 days of testing, and we're on it. Sometimes 2 to 3 weeks of testing, but sometimes some vehicles will need a month and a half. It's going to depend. But usually you can figure out we're going to do a new application within about 2 months right now.
That's really good. That's pretty impressive. Because imagine just the whole, I've been on your side of the desk and bringing new products to work. And I know there's so much on the R&D side, but once you have the basics and then roll from there, right?
Yeah, there's a lot involved. We have developed over the years our own proprietary system for shock development. We have a database with thousands and thousands of different applications. So we learn from that and we can simulate and apply that to other vehicles. So we speed up the process. But in the end, there's always a tuner assessing in the field on the actual vehicle. And very often the bottlenecks for us being located in Canada is access to the vehicle. And also access to terrain, because we can test in the trails here, but not over the winter. So we travel to California, down to Colorado. We test in various locations to have different kind of terrain, and we partner with our clients, our friends, our other manufacturers, such as guys making the A-arms or wheels. We partner with them for testing. We have a network of manufacturers. The first one to get access to a vehicle will call the others, and we all go testing together for a session for a week or two.
Yeah. That sounds like it'd be a fun time.
It's a fun time once the shocks are working correctly, but it's not fun when it's not working properly, because to get a truck to drive good as we like it, we're going to spend hours and hours in the seat getting it wrong.
Yes, I realize that one all too well. So like I say, come back from the racing side of it, there's lots of seat time trying to figure out all these little things. Now, one of the things you guys do different, being that you're based in Canada, you guys know what winter is like. And I've had other shock manufacturers and I've had friends with other shock manufacturers where those things are rusting within a year, 18 months kind of idea. So you guys have got that kind of figured out, being Canadians.
Exactly. Even when we started making ATV shocks, just the ATVs and UTVs are used in various conditions. We know how to make a shock withstand this kind of weather. When we started with trucks, there's a little more involved in terms of hose fittings and metal brackets holding the reservoir and stuff like that we really put a lot of thought to make sure that it could withstand the weather. And we keep improving on that aspect every year.
Yeah. The other thing, too, is that you don't really see, if you're selling shocks all around the world, you're talking about different temperatures overall. So you're talking Southern California or Parker, Arizona, where it's pretty much hot all the time. As you move up into Canada or into Michigan, you're running different temperatures in that. Do you find that the cold temperatures versus the hot temperatures affect a vehicle's performance or a shock's performance?
It does affect when you start the vehicle, because if the vehicle has been sitting overnight in cold, the oil can tend to be a little thicker. But as soon as you start riding, after only a couple cycles, the shock will be to operating temperature. So it doesn't matter for long. It mostly matters for the type of seals we're using. If you're driving in Canada and you bring the shocks to temperature, they're hot, and you park your car overnight and it gets cold, the expansion of the materials is very important to control, so you don't create a leak overnight by having something dilated that's metal and something rubber that's not following and create a leak. So we pay special attention to that. But usually, even if it's hot or cold weather, the operating temperature of a shock is much higher than the environment around it.
Yeah.
So in cold weather, the shock's going to be much more efficient at cooling down. But even at 46 degrees Celsius weather in California when we test, the shock is running around 100 and 110. So it doesn't matter if it's 46. It's still going to cool down as you drive and you move. If you're using the shock intensively, they're going to be very hot no matter what the weather is. And they will want to cool down, because if you're using hard, you're driving fast, there's a lot of air movement, so it's going to cool out anyway. So it's not that big of a factor,
Okay.
but it's as big of a concern when you stop riding so you don't create a leak.
Yeah, that makes sense. I get that for sure. Now, one of the other things you guys do with some of the vehicles is you make a coilover shock. So that's basically a shock absorber and a new coil spring assembly on there. You do that for the Toyotas, and there's other vehicles that you don't do that for, which is the Jeep, because that's more the design from the factory style is more a separate spring and coil, or sorry, a separate coil and a separate shock there.
Yeah.
Some of the manufacturers have optional spring rates on some of their coilovers and that. Is that something that you guys have had requests on, or do you find that a lot of your changes are done through your adjustability of the shock?
The adjustability of the shock is just to control the movement for the same vehicle. The adjustment is useful when you change the riding condition or the riding style. But on a given vehicle for the same driving style, springs will change depending on the weight of the vehicle. For example, if you take a Tacoma shock, most manufacturer will ship them with a standard off-the-shelf spring that's one size fits all.
Yeah.
We do have multiple spring rate options,
okay,
heavier or lighter depending on what kind of driving you want to do. So we figure out what the baseline is for that vehicle for what we decide is a standard use for our shock. For example, in the Tacoma, we're going to use a 13-inch long spring with a 700-pound spring rate. But if you want to have a more compliant, street-oriented, comfort type of driving, we can go down to a 650.
Yep.
If you have a bumper winch and extra weight like skids plates, we can bump it up to a 750. But not only just the rate, but also the length. Our shock can use a 13-inch or a 14-inch. So you can go longer spring with a lighter rate, which gives you the lift, but still have the compliant ride. Or you can have a lowered vehicle, but with more capacity for charging. So it depends on the vehicle and what your type of use is. Usually when you buy from Elka, and either direct through us or via our preferred dealers, they're going to ask you a couple of questions. What's your type of driving? What's your intended use? How much modifications you've made on the vehicle? How much weight have you added? And they're going to factor all these factors in, and all these parameters will be taken into account to give you the proper spring rate for your use. But also, it might also affect the damping inside the shock, because moving to a higher spring rate, you have more spring pushing to extend the shock. So you want to have a stronger damping to control that spring. Not only do we offer many variations of springs, but we have more than one valving type for most of the popular trucks. And in terms of what is a coilover versus non-coilover, a shock is called a coilover when it's self-contained with its own spring.
Yeah.
On a Jeep, the springs are separate from the dampers from stock, but there are manufacturers converting them to coilovers. Companies like Rebel Off-Road, they will offer a kit that you can take out the stock springs and replace everything with a coilover shock, so you have more control over the spring transition, more travel. There's all kinds of benefits from switching to that, but it's not possible on all vehicles. For example, if you have a Ford F-250, the coils are separate from the shocks, but there's very few options that you can change them to. So the damping in these configurations is more important, because it's going to dictate how high the truck is riding in its travel. So we really go with each truck, what is the intended use, what kind of riding they're going to do. Obviously, a Tacoma is more nimble, it's better suited for tight trails. You're not going to find a full-scale F-350 usually in a small, tight trail, very rocky to do rock climbing. So we're going to adapt the shock design to the vehicle and its use.
And there's so many different, you take a Tacoma, you've got guys like, as you mentioned, with a winch and a bumper and armor. and they are just hitting the FSRs and to go camping kind of idea. Or you can have a guy that's out there beating it and using it on the rocks and different things like that. The fact that you guys can listen to your customers and ask questions before that purchase, whether it's through one of your recommended dealers or Elka itself, I think that's a big thing, because there is over-the-counter shocks, but there's the fact that you guys have all the options for all these different people and vehicles. It's good.
Yes, because these different kind of use, if you compare a rock crawler to an overlander, or a guy that's trying to build a pre-runner for desert riding, and the other one's a daily driver that just want to go to the cottage over the weekend, this is so different in time of needs for the shock that you cannot have one that's going to fit everything. So it's very important to listen to the customer and customize up to a certain point the shock to the kind of use. That's going to avoid the customers from having to make very expensive and very work-intensive mistakes. So even if a shock like ours seems more expensive, the fact that you had in those little added value features, you're going to save in the long run, because you're not going to have to rebuy springs, you're not going to have to revalve your shock, and you're not going to have to do it 2 or 3 times before you find out exactly what you need. So we screwed up doing the testing, so you don't have to screw up when you buy.
Exactly. And yes, you guys' shocks are a bit more expensive, but it's all relative. They're obviously not, as I mentioned earlier, and I don't want to slag on the competition. We used to call the Rancho RS5000s the white pogo sticks, and you bolt on a bunch of them and put 2, 3, 4 at a wheel and go from there. But that's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with, as you mentioned, shocks are engineered specifically for your vehicle, and there is all these different options and questions. They're a lot better quality shock than a $100 shock or a $200 shock kind of idea. So
yeah, and we're using better materials, more durable materials. The shock is fully rebuildable with inexpensive parts, so you can keep them as long as you have your vehicle, because you can refurbish them when they're needed servicing. But also, usually, it's not only the components and the material that you're paying for, it's the engineering behind. So we spend a lot of hours testing and optimizing in various conditions, and that's part of the cost as well.
Yeah, definitely. Now, bushings. Are you guys urethane or rubber?
We don't have a lot of bushings. We started with bushings on some models. We found out that it's durable for most cases, but it's not performant. If something's not moving much, it's good. But if you have a lot of rotation, it's no good. So we're using high quality spherical bearings with the spacers on the outside for the mounting. So it gives you a lot more angle, a much more durable ride, and it's inexpensive to replace, and it's easy to replace. If you try to replace a bushing, it's a much harder job. And
one of the things I want to do, you mentioned preferred dealers, and you've got preferred dealers around the world, whether it be for the power sports or for the 4x4 world. One of the dealers I wanted to give a shout out to is Vil and his crew at Crave Automotive in Calgary. He's the one that got us connected, but the Crave crew have been huge supporters of the Elka Suspension, pretty much right from the start, almost kind of idea.
Yes, basically, when we started, they were one of the very first dealer that we worked with. They're very knowledgeable, and they have a lot of experience on the Toyota platform. And they help us a lot avoiding design mistakes. A lot of their input based off other brands helped us make a better product. Also, they have a very similar mindset to Elka, which is listen to the customer, take your time, give them advice, let them make the choice, and support them in that choice by providing very good after-sales support. And we've been working with them, I think it's close to 5 years now or more. And we've traveled there, we've visited the shop, we've done some testing and riding with them. And when we say a preferred or top-tier dealer for us, is we feel that these guys offer a premium service and more added value for the customers than the average shop that just want to sell you the parts. They do the installation. They're going to give you the proper advice on how to properly install, maintain. They've been there out on the trail. They know how to drive. They know how to ride. They know what's going to break. So they have a lot of experience. And they share that both with the customers and the manufacturers. And that's why we appreciate them so much.
Yeah, great group of people at Crave. Not just Vil. Like I consider him a good friend of mine, but the whole rest of the crew has got that same mentality behind them. And they're all a great bunch of guys and gals there.
And on to that about Crave. You mentioned Vil, but one of the main characters in Crave is also Ryan, which is one of the founding owners. Ryan, his background was always been high level Toyota technician, and they only hire certified Toyota journeymen. So these guys not only have the experience of the shocks and the off-roading, but they know vehicles and they know Toyotas inside out. So that's the kind of partners we want to deal with. And also another good thing with Crave is that they are an Elka stocking dealer. That reduces the lead time, because when you order shocks, you're going to have to wait. With every single company, there's always a waiting list. But having a stocking dealer like Crave, and they're able to swap the springs, do the reval, so they basically can take a shock they have on their shelf and customize it the same way we would to ensure that the customer is getting the right product.
Yeah, that definitely makes a big difference, because availability sometimes can be a little tough on some things. But one of the other things too is they actually use their vehicles. You alluded to it earlier. And to me, if I go into a shop and they're trying to sell me something and I never see them out on the trail, or I know they don't wheel, the guy drives a Honda Civic, I'm less going to listen to him kind of idea. And I think that for the companies that do have 4x4 shops, when I see their owners and their staff out wheeling and using products, I'm going to trust them a lot sooner than the guy that drives the Honda Civic to the shop, right?
Correct. And I've had a similar experience with my background in mountain bikes, where I had some kids, like a 16-year-old kid that can't afford a bike, try to sell me on a $12,000 bike. It's harder to buy.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, if no matter where you are, I definitely recommend dealing with people that are actually out there wheeling or overlanding or racing or whatever you're into, because these guys have the experience to help you make the right decisions.
A lot of our staff is comprised of racers or riders, whether it be motocross, side-by-side, UTVs. We all have some kind of a toy, so we know what we're talking about. Myself, I have a 4Runner that I built for overlanding. I wheel it just like a UTV. So I can jump it, I can drive it fast. That's where we come from. That's what we like. And that's how we can put so much passion into what we do.
How many people are at Elka now?
We're about 55 right now.
That's a fair-sized company.
It is. You're probably going to have like half of that's going to be production staff and quality control and warehouse. The other half is going to be offices, including myself in the sales department and design, engineers, tuners.
So you get an order, whether it be from a retail customer or from somebody like Crave. You get an order that comes in, and these are the specs. This is what they want. Can you build us through the process of building that shock?
So usually when the order is going to come in, it's going to start with a processing an order in our in-house software that we design. So that software is going to allow you to select a bunch of parameters. What is the vehicle? What is the model year? What is the geometry? What's the added weight? So by answering a bunch of questions, it's going to generate the proper recipe for that shock. And then we're going to print out a work order. And for most of our truck product, we're going to go, we have two production lines. One is a high volume with big contracts for big manufacturers, but most of the customers will go to our smaller aftermarket line. So it's going to be one technician building a full set of shocks. So by the time we place the order, another employee is going to print out the production sheets. He's going to run around the shops, gather all the parts, put everything in a box, and bring that to an assembler that is going to build up the entire set of shocks. Then a second employee is going to finish that shock by bleeding out the oil, making sure that it's filled properly and it's all preset, filled with nitrogen. And then it's going to go to a dynamometer, what we call a dyno, and it's going to get tested. So every single shock unit gets tested on a dyno to ensure that it's reaching the proper values, that it's calibrated correctly, and that there's no manufacturing defects. And then it's going to go to finishing with decals, setting the clickers, installing the springs, then packaging and shipping. The entire process of building a shock, from the moment we start a job, it's going to be something like one day to assemble the shock order for a guy, and 40 hours quarantine to make sure there's no leak and everything's good. So by the time we start working on a job to the time it ships, it's about 3 days. Current lead times at Elka are about 5 to 8 weeks for truck stuff because we still experience more demand than we can match, especially right now when the season's starting up.
Yeah.
So that's the regular lead time for us. I'm hearing that a lot of other manufacturers are much longer than that. Some are shorter. Usually shorter means it's not going to be built to order. It's going to be a stock one, a standardized one-size-fits-all shock.
Now, you call it the dynamometer. Is that basically a machine that compresses and rebounds the shock to make sure everything's working correctly?
Exactly. You're going to have a pressure sensor on it, so it's going to calculate how much force is applied on the shock and how much it is absorbed. So what we want to see is at a certain shock speed, we want to reach certain values to make sure we have enough damping for that speed at the shock. A test like this is going to take between 2 to 3 minutes, and it's going to tell us everything about the shock.
That's cool. That's really neat. Being able to see everything, like the full testing, because there's nothing worse than getting the shock and it doesn't work or it's leaking or whatever. So quality control.
Yeah, and other details are very important, such as making sure that the left and right shock have exactly the same values at the same clicker position. That's a small detail, but from a consumer point of view, if you want to set your shocks at 5 out of 10, you want both shocks to feel the same. You don't want to have a vehicle out of balance because it could even be dangerous.
Yeah, for sure. Getting away from Elka for a second, I know that you mentioned you're a Toyota guy. If there's anywhere that you could go wheeling in Canada, where would it be?
If I choose anywhere in Canada, I'd say anywhere between Alberta to BC would be the preferred destination.
Yep.
Mainly because of the views, the valleys, the mountains. You have everything over there.
Yeah.
But I was born on the East Coast. I've been driving and riding most of the East Coast. The cool stuff is further out, but it's so remote that you feel like you're at the end of the world.
Yeah.
So I'd say East Coast and West Coast are very good, but West Coast has more of a wow factor. East Coast riding, you're not as exposed. There's not as much of a high elevation, but damn, can you drive fast.
And the East Coast people. I'd take East Coast people over BC people any day.
Oh, thank you. If you can keep up with, apparently we're very cool people to hang out with if you can keep up.
Yes. And a lot of those East Coast people know how to drink. Oh my God.
Yeah, maybe it's the weather. I don't know.
We've interviewed a lot of East Coasters and lots of great people out there for sure. But I have to admit, man, here in BC, we got the mountains, we got the grasslands, we got the ocean, we got it all. So sorry, Saskatchewan.
Exactly. When we do our testing, we often go to California, which on video looks cool, the desert, everything, but it's always the same.
Yeah.
Once you've tried it, everything's the same. Up in Quebec, you have a couple of technical trails, but they're usually short sections. But man, in BC and Alberta, and anywhere in the Rockies, you have all kinds of terrain. Everything is so varied and it's so cool, and it's remote and it's nice, and the weather's good too.
See, I've often thought I would actually like to go wheeling to Quebec because that is one of the provinces I haven't wheeled in yet. And I've always thought it would be neat to go a little farther north up into Quebec there and do some exploring up in that area.
If you ever come, let me know. We'll guide you around and make sure to bring a canoe.
That's one of my other loves, actually, is canoeing and kayaking. Yeah, that's a perfect way to have a trip, I think.
Yeah, the best East Coast trip will be you're going to have to do a lot of highway. Then you're going to have to do a lot of logging roads. And then you get to a small lake. You can set up camp, canoe, and then you go hit the trails.
Yeah. Sounds like a good life to me.
It is, but it's so busy right here that any chance we get to ride, we're out on the trail.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't blame you on that for sure. So is there anything that we missed or that you wanted to talk about or mention?
I think you're going to see more and more products coming out of Elka, especially for guys that are building their own rigs or want to do custom stuff. There's been a lot of changes at Elka. We've been purchased 2-3 years ago by Liberty Spring, which is a big spring manufacturing company.
Yep.
And they want to have their own line of springs. They're going to come up with new technologies that we're going to put on Elka shocks. And Elka has a bunch of new products such as bomb stops and all goodies that we're looking forward to launch soon.
Cool. Looking forward to that for sure. So I was wondering about bump stops and other things like that. So looking forward to that for sure. The last question we ask every guest is, what Canadian would you like to listen to in the 4x4 Canada podcast?
Ooh, I have two that quickly come to mind. I would say Chad from ARC Training, ARC Off-Road Training. He's the guy that put me on the right path in terms of doing off-roading safely.
Yep.
And the other guy that comes to mind would be Virgil Deseroux from Northbound Expeditions. He's an avid rider. He guides people voluntarily. He's a very good guy. I had the chance to meet him a couple times, and he also has a business making some bags and accessories, and I think that he has a very nice perspective, and he's from New Brunswick, so that would give you another perspective.
Definitely great suggestions on both parts. I know of both of them. I've met Chad a few times. We're both in BC, right? I've met him a few times, and both great suggestions. Once again, we're talking with Patrick from Elka Suspension, and I really want to thank you, Pat, because this was a great interview, because we talked about the Elka part of it. But we also talked about the technical stuff and what makes a shock and how a shock works and et cetera. So I think our listeners are really going to enjoy listening to this and learning a lot from it.
If they have other questions or they want to learn more, they can call up Elka, ask questions. We're there for it, and we're happy to talk to people.
That is awesome. I really appreciate that. And I really want to thank you for coming on and taking the last part of your day here and spending time with us and going through this. And I can't wait to get out to Quebec and do some wheeling with you.
Thank you very much, Wes, for the invitation. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure. I really look forward to possibly wheel with you at some point, especially if you come out to Quebec. We'll have a good time.
You have to let me know when you come out to see Vil and the guys at Crave, Vil and Ryan at Crave. And
we'll do. That's the plan, to go there this summer.
Cool. Yeah, we'll have to keep us in mind, and maybe we can meet there as well. It's a little easier on a drive for me.
Hey, by the way, keep doing what you do. It's very good that you're spreading the word about 4x4 in Canada. I wish there was more people like you promoting the sport and the activity. And I just discovered your podcast, and I have hours and hours of driving that I'm going to listen to it now.
It's been a passion project for the last couple of years, and Tricia and I both love doing it, and we hope to be here for another couple of years. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Wes.
Thanks.